Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very, very senior and a recognized educator from Minneapolis, USA, Srilata Zaheer. Sri, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Ashutosh. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Sri is the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. She's a board director of H.B. Fuller. She's the Elmer Andersen Chair in Global CSR and the Dean Emerita of the University of Minnesota, Carlson School of Management. And given her track record and background, she's been recognized, awarded, and felicitated several times. So, Sri, before we talk about CSR, tell me about your own amazing journey.
Well, it's sort of, a lot of it was serendipity, things that I didn't expect. So, I grew up in India, in Chennai. I went to college in Chennai and then, on to an MBA in IIM Ahmedabad when I was far too young to do a business degree at that point. I was, 19 years old when I started. Mm-hmm. And that's where I met my husband as well, actually on the theater stage at IIM. Mm-hmm. But it was, and after that, worked in Bombay for a number of years, worked in Nigeria for a few years, and I got the bug to really be in academia because when my husband got this wonderful job in Nigeria, mm-hmm. and when I followed him, the only job I could get was at the local university. Mm-hmm. And, I had been internal auditor at Sandoz. So this was, at that point, I felt this was a bit of a come down, but it's like snakes and ladders, you go down a bit. Absolutely. And then you suddenly realize that, what? I actually love this. And so it was not a very planned journey, if you will. It was very much, seizing opportunities. And, that, of course, having decided that I wanted to be in academics, we landed at MIT for a PhD, and so did my husband. And at the end of it, when we both graduated, there were 2 jobs at the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota. Mm-hmm. It's been a wonderful place. No regrets. Been having a great time.
And as they say, the rest is history.
That's right. Over 3 decades ago.
Amazing. What an amazing journey. So, Sri, let's talk about now your current role as the chair of Global CSR and the Dean Emerita for the University of Minnesota. And let me start by asking you, what does it mean for a corporation to be responsible?
People can think about all kinds of things. They can talk about the triple bottom line of people, profits, planet, or think about in terms of environmental, societal, and governance issues. But the reality is that it comes down to one very simple thing, which is doing the right thing by all your stakeholders. Mm-hmm. That's it. Do the right thing always. And I think that's what it means to be a responsible corporation.
Fascinating. And when it comes to stakeholders, which stakeholders come first when it comes to responsibility? Planet, nation, society, community, shareholders, employees, or someone else?
There is no first. And I think the most important thing is not to think about what decisions you make as trade-offs, but to think about it as, how are you being fair to all of these constituents? Fairness is paramount. Transparency is paramount. It's also important to try and take an integrative look at this. I mean, there are some wonderful examples of just, in fact, in my hometown, Best Buy is a major retailer of consumer electronics, and they have actually found a whole new line of business in selling recycled, refurbished consumer electronics in their outlet stores. Wow. So they've realized that there's a customer segment that, may not be ready to pay the price for a new appliance, but they're ready to. So they have created this whole new business opportunity, which is also good for the planet in terms of, recycling, getting and not, especially used electronics with their stamp behind it. Of course, the car companies have been doing this forever. I mean, for the longest time now, my husband and I, we only buy pre-owned certified cars. I mean, for one thing, it's
Yeah.
it's a lot less expensive. Once the car drives off the lot, the depreciation is taken.
Yeah.
But it's a way of really also contributing to, making sure that we don't waste resources.
Very well said. Very well said. And both very good examples of Best Buy and the automobile companies, because these are giants of America. My next question is that, we've had CSR for a long time, and that's now evolved into ESG. But what role does CSR reporting play in promoting responsible practices?
I think it does focus top managers' minds on this. I mean, when you have to report something, you're aware of what needs to be done and you're conscious of the decisions in terms of the decisions you take. At the same time, sometimes these reporting practices can become extremely onerous. I mean, the EU, for instance, has the new Corporate Social Responsibility Directive, which is not just about climate change, which, I mean, the US SEC is thinking about, reporting requirements which only focus on climate change, but the EU's is far ranging. And it's not just for companies headquartered in Europe, it's for all firms that have activities in Europe that are above a certain fairly low material level. And the reporting requirements are really, really onerous. It's going to be expensive for companies to do this. Of course, there's a whole consulting practice that has come up around it. If there are any students out there thinking of what to do, this might not be a bad area to go into.
Absolutely.
But it's, there are costs to this. And at the end result, you hope that there is some impact on climate, on how employees are treated, how customers are treated, etc. And I think there is some, because it focuses managers' minds on these issues. It also perhaps shames some companies if they compare themselves to others and say, "Hey, listen, we're not doing as well as Unilever or whatever." So it's just a question of. So I think it does have some impact. But I don't think we should underestimate the costs of reporting.
Absolutely right. Well said. And my next question is, how can responsible corporations contribute to sustainable development? And I'd love one or two examples from you.
Well, I think, the UN SDG goals are all, we've seen all of them.
Yeah.
It's about everything from clean water to clean energy, etc. I think there are multiple ways in which companies can contribute to these goals. First of all, of course, keeping their own house in order, make sure that their carbon emissions are not, are controlled, are declining, and they find more energy efficient ways of doing things themselves. But the other thing is really what they do for customers in terms of lines of business. So again, an example from our backyard. Minneapolis happens to be a major headquarters city. I mean, it's one of the most hidden gems that nobody knows about. In fact, it's a city of many, many lakes. You can see one of them behind me.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's so it's Ecolab is a company in our neighborhood, and they are very much into helping their clients, reduce water usage. How can you develop technologies that are use fewer resources. Another great company in our backyard, Land O'Lakes, it helps, helps farmers. I mean, they get so much data from their drones and, from satellite imagery on exactly where, there is insects are coming in, where pesticides may be required. So they reduce the use of pesticides. You can, so even in the agriculture field, there's so much that companies can do to help the planet in terms of using fewer resources and getting more output.
Well said. My next question is that what role does corporate governance play in ensuring responsible practices?
Corporate governance, it's really about a lot of it is about transparency. It's about making sure that people know why decisions are being taken. At the board level, I think it's important. I'm again serve on on the board of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, which is doing a lot to, in fact, promote diversity, for instance, in its top management ranks. But the idea is to find the best talent that is out there, and we've done a very good job with that. So I think that, the board needs to ask about what the management is doing in terms of sustainable practices, in terms of being good to employees, about allowing for employee the voice of the employees to be heard. How well they're treating their vendors, their supply chain, because now more and more, your relationship with your vendors matters a great deal. Especially we saw that during the pandemic. So I think there are many things that boards can do to just make sure that these questions are asked and there's accountability for what management does.
Absolutely right. Well said. But the other question that is that how can companies address ethical dilemmas and make responsible decisions?
It's sometimes the ethical dilemmas that are presented are so extreme. For most of the time, the dilemmas are such that a reasonable person can think through them and say, where is least harm being done? And where can we make sure that, sometimes it may be that you have to honor the unchosen. There's a decision that you made that is better for, say, one group or one person versus the other. And then you decide that, you have to balance it out by making sure that the group that was not, as well looked after, perhaps, is looked after better in the next round. So these are over time, and you find a way to balance. It's like a gyroscope. You're constantly trying to balance all these competing interests. And as I said, don't think of it as trade-offs. Think of it as an integrative solution. How can we get a win-win out of this?
And the next question is, how can a responsible company promote employee well-being and work-life balance?
I think the pandemic has taught us that, how to manage with flexibility.
Right.
So I think the key is work with flexibility. We still expect you to work for the salary that you're paid, but make sure that there is that workers have the flexibility to attend to family needs when they need to. Make sure that the working conditions, safety, health are things that you pay attention to. But also just, employee mental health. And sometimes it's just a question of making sure that, that work is that employees are enjoying their work.
Correct.
That it is fun, that work is fun is something that we should also kind of keep in mind.
Wonderful. You just spoke about the SDGs and they were preceded by the MDGs. The understanding of SDGs in the corporate world is much greater today. My question is, how can responsible corporations contribute to the achievement of the SDGs? And there's not too much time left now.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's as I said, it's everything. It's what you're doing yourself. It's also what you're doing in terms of your products and communities. I firmly believe that at the end of the day, doing the right thing is important. And doing the right thing by your employees, by your customers, by the community will end up sort of supporting the SDGs in some small way.
Yeah.
I mean, one corporation is not going to be able to change inequality, but you can do, each corporation can do its bit, just as easy each individual can do their bits in terms of supporting some of the sustainable development goals.
Wonderful. The other question I wanted to ask you was about corporate philanthropy and charitable giving. America is probably one of the only countries in the world where people give the most. I'd love to get your perspective on what are some of the ethical considerations when it comes to giving.
That's a great question. We have learned to give after coming to this country because it's really the generosity here is outstanding.
Absolutely.
But I think there are two aspects to it. I think that in terms of supporting the communities in which you're located, I think a corporation can do a lot. Like for instance, in Minnesota, the Minnesota Orchestra, the Guthrie Theater, there are all these arts organizations which are heavily dependent on corporate support. And partly it is a way to, if we have a vibrant arts community in the Twin Cities, it attracts the best employees to come and work here. So it's not completely selfless giving. There is a purpose that you want a really great city for your employees and for your workers. And that's something that I think, in some ways, tying your charitable giving to what your objectives are is helpful. While it's, doesn't feel like, pure charity, but it is focused charity. So it's, again, at US Bank, for instance, is very focused on, supporting, say, low-income housing. And so that ties in very closely to some extent with what they are good at, what they know about. But then there are also organizations that need to sort of support activities in the community that may not be directly related to them, but as I said, which create a better environment for their employees, for their customers, and so on. So that's I would think of charitable giving in that sense, that you're doing good, but it ends up supporting what you want to accomplish.
Well said. Great response. Thank you. I've time for 2 or 3 more questions. My next question is, what are the responsibilities of corporations towards human rights?
Again, a very, very good question. I think the first few things are, of course, you want to have gender equity. You want to make sure that you're not discriminating against some group of workers or employees, that you're treating people right. And, for example, I think child labor is something that we should be all concerned about. So things of this kind of thing, again, it's about doing the right thing. And in the course of doing the right thing, I believe you also end up supporting human rights, human values.
Well said. 2 more questions for you. What, in your view, is the role of government to be able to promote corporate responsibility? And I know in the US, government doesn't intervene almost at all. But given the rest of the world where governments have a big say, including India, I'd love to get your perspective on what should governments do in promoting corporate responsibility?
Well, you'd be surprised. The US actually has quite a lot of regulation.
Oh, it does? Okay, I'm not aware of that. Thank you for telling me.
Well, for example, the SEC right now is coming up with sort of requirements on climate reporting. It's not yet in the law, but it's coming down the turnpike. And so there is a fair amount of regulation in the US on all kinds of things, from safety of toys to you name it. And the issue really is that regulation is needed sometimes, especially in situations where markets are not automatically self-regulating. And so but you just have to make sure that there isn't overkill on the regulation front. So in terms of corporate responsibility as such, I'm sure there can be regulations on transparency, on the nature of the board, on accountability. Those kinds of regulations are probably not a bad thing, especially in an environment where there are a lot of, say, family-run corporations. You want to make sure that there is accountability because, we've all seen crazy scandals, in many places. So I think there is a role for government, there's a role for auditors, there is a role for regulation, but we just have to make sure that it doesn't become overkill.
Absolutely. Well said. And my last question to you, Sri, given the amount of work you have done in the area of responsible corporations, if you look into your crystal ball, what are some future trends and innovations you see for responsible corporations?
I firmly believe that it's this taking this integrative view of how you do the right thing by all your stakeholders. You know, that's where the future lies. That's where the best hope lies for our planet, for the communities, for workers, for customers. You know, you have to, build high quality products for your customers. Make sure that your customers are satisfied and are given good products. You have to make sure that your workers are working in good conditions and that they have good mental health and health support and support for work-life balance. You have to make sure that the communities you're in are healthy, that they're thriving, so that attracts the best talent. I think the real war in the future in terms of companies is going to be the war for talent. That's the single most desirable asset right now is talent.
Absolutely.
And in that war for talent, you have to take care of a whole lot of other things to make sure that you have access to the best talent that you can find.
Well said. And on that note, Sri, thank you so much for speaking to me. Thank you for sharing with me your own amazing journey. I mean, it's amazing to go from one city to another, from one country to the other, and then reach the US in the world of academia and do so many wonderful things. We didn't get a chance to speak about your other roles as the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, but someday maybe I'll reach out to you and do a separate session on that particular role, because that's completely different from what you're doing. Thank you for speaking to me about so many different aspects about responsible corporations. I think I learned many new things from you about what responsible corporations should be doing. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashutosh. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.